Hi everyone, welcome to the final day of our 3-day Pan-Canadian Health Information Exchange Standards Workshop. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an adjunct assistant professor here at the University of Victoria. I'm also an active health interoperability standards implementer and advocate, particularly in the areas of SNOMED-CT and FHIR. I'm also the instructor of the University of Victoria's HIMP 537 course on Health Information Exchange Standards, which is hosting this 3-day workshop series. So welcome everyone. But before we get started, let's do our territory acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So we've had 2 wonderful workshops already, and today, as I said, is the final day of our virtual workshops. It's Wednesday, May the 8th. So today's focus is all about HL7 FHIR, the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. Like the first 2 days, at the end of the guest speaker presentations, I'll be staying with the students of HIMP 537 to work through some hands-on activities, which are all related to FHIR resources, profiling, and FHIR terminology servers. So if you'd like to join us for these activities next time to get a better understanding of terminology and interoperability and FHIR, you can enrol in the University of Victoria's Certificate in Health Terminology and Interoperability Standards. This is a 1-year part-time program with 4 graduate level courses done weekly with weekly online evening classes, plus this virtual workshop. This is the only terminology standards program in Canada that's accredited by CHIMA, the Canadian College of Health Information Management, to become a certified terminology standards specialist in Canada. So if you'd like to join our September 2024 intake, please apply by June the 1st and either very quickly scan the QR code here or visit uvic.ca/hsd-himf/certificates. So here's today's agenda. We have 3 great speakers with us to present on FHIR topics. And then, as I said, the students will stay on afterwards to work on some hands-on activities. And first up, we're very fortunate to have Sheridan Cook and Irfan Hakim, who will be presenting together on the Finding, Using, Shaping Pan-Canadian FHIR Standards, Bases, Cores and Mores. And just a brief introduction to Sheridan and Irfan before they get started. Sheridan is a management consultant with Accenture Consulting. Her background is in health information exchange, service development, and patient access APIs. She assists clients in developing Pan-Canadian profiles, implementation guides, and FHIR implementations. She's the co-chair of the Canadian Baseline FHIR Profiling Group and a member of HL7 Canada Council. And Irfan is a data and AI consultant with Accenture Consulting. His background is in mental health, digital solutions evaluation, and patient-centered care. Irfan assists clients in developing Pan-Canadian profiles, implementation guides, and FHIR implementations. And Irfan is the co-chair, a co-chair of the SNOMED on FHIR working group and a faculty member at the University of Toronto. And with that, I will pass the floor to Sheridan and Irfan. Thank you so very much. Over to you.
Thanks, Linda. I think we might get maybe the award for like the longest title that someone's made you read today. But we are going to talk to you guys about quite a lot today. So the title's fair warning. So like Linda had mentioned, I think I've been coming to this particular workshop for the last couple of years and talking a lot about the baseline. And when we first started discussing what as a community working group that we were doing in this space and what the baseline meant and how to utilize it, it was one of the kind of first Pan-Canadian FHIR standards that was available. And in the 4 years, I think since we've been coming back, the amount of Pan-Canadian FHIR standards and specifications that we have available to us as implementers, as authors, as folks who are actually participating in shaping them has totally exploded. And so our goals today, we're going to cover a lot of ground. but we want to get you really excited about standards philosophy and why we do the work that we do and why we think you should do the work with us. We want to give you that 10,000-foot view of, what's out there, what does the landscape look like, what's available, and has gone through kind of a number of cycles versus maybe what's in development, and to give you a sense of kind of where kind of baseline and core and other domains fit within that space. And ultimately, I think, our primary goal is to kind of convince you to be a part of the communities that are developing them and give you a little bit of the kind of run through of the tools and some of the instructions on how you actually use the specifications that we have available to us. And so I think we talked a little bit about our introductions. The only thing that I wanted to highlight is that you folks are kind of looking at Irfan and myself. We are people that are much like you, right? That got involved because we were passionate about something in the space of healthcare. And we decided to kind of throw our hat in the ring and say, how can we help? And we became co-chairs, Irfan on the Smart on Fire working group, myself on the Canadian Fire Baseline. And if you take away nothing else from this experience, it should be that this is anyone who is passionate and willing to spend 30 minutes, an hour in a week progressing something you care about with other people who feel the same way, has a place within the Canadian standards space and is desperately needed to help refine the specifications that we're going to talk to you about today. So take that with what you will, but that is, I think, a huge goal of ours is to also grow the community that's working on this as well. So I'm going to try to make this a little bit interactive. It's a little bit harder to see, but I'll ask you a couple times throughout, you can raise your hand, on Zoom, just a couple questions that I might have to kind of gauge where folks are sitting. So how many of you, just raise your hands if you have that capacity, have gone to HL7.org/FHIR, have kind of interacted with the FHIR-based standard in some way? I see some claps. Handful. Okay. Of those folks, how many of you have heard about the Canadian Fire Registry on Simplifier? Maybe take your hand down if you haven't heard of it or haven't interacted it in some way. I see some more clapping. Okay, I'm actually seeing some more folks pop up that have heard of the Canadian Fire Registry. Brilliant. Okay, so the reason I asked this is because when I first started working in fire, I went straight to the base specification, right? HL7.fire or HL7.org/FHIR, and I was like, this is everything I need. I see all the elements that I think I could potentially interact with. I was very focused on patient access. So a lot of the things that I was seeing that were available to me, they made sense. What I wish somebody would have told me when I first started out was that, FHIR is called a platform standard because it's supposed to kind of be like a set of building blocks, right? So it's a consistent manner in ways in which that we describe concepts that happen in the healthcare space, right? And we give them a syntax and a language and a consistent structure. And by all effectively using the same building blocks, that means that when information kind of leaves our system, it's going to look the same. But, it's built with this intent of being highly flexible, right? So the resources that you see and the elements within those resources are intended to cover a bunch of different use cases. They're intended to cover a bunch of different regions, right? It's international in its nature. And they're intended to cover a lot of different choices for implementation and architecture. And so part of that flexibility means that, if FHIR is the bricks, there's a lot of different ways that you can stack those bricks together to meet a requirement. So you can choose to build a house or a barn or a stadium with those bricks. But the bricks alone aren't really going to be the thing that out of the box lets you start building right away and in a way that's going to be the most efficient. So when we think about how do we use that platform specification and how do we use FHIR, FHIR says this is how a concept could be modeled. But, the rules on these are the elements that are used at this point in time. And for this specific context, they're intentionally kept largely optional within the FHIR-based specification. And so you can't really just slap it down and say, okay, we're doing it. We're doing FHIR. We're going to do all the use cases that we want because this exists as a set of kind of guidelines on the internet. And so FHIR gives us the structure called profiling, and that's the space that Irfan and I really kind of live in. And so profiles kind of effectively are what allows for you to take that structure that you see on the left and start to apply rules that say, okay, in these contexts and scenarios, these are the elements I care about. These ones, maybe I don't care so much about, or I really don't like. These are the things that, because the FHIR-based specification is intended to kind of have this 80-20 rule of like not cover everything absolutely all the time, maybe that I want to add in, that I want to extend to cover my particular need or use case. Sometimes profiles allow us to say, these are the rules about the terminologies I care about. I want you to use the Canadian version or Canadian edition of SNOMED and this particular value set from the Canadian edition of SNOMED. And profiles allow us to say, and here's how strongly I feel about that and how strongly I'm going to enforce that you use it. But if you're thinking about FHIR like a set of bricks, profiling is kind of what I would describe as like a blueprint, right? It allows for you to say, here's how you might take those materials together and form like the picture of what you want, that information, like how you want it to be used, what is it going to look like when it actually gets used in a production workflow. And when we talk about implementation guides are effectively like they house those blueprints and they put it alongside guidance on like, how is this space going to be used, right? Like, how are folks going to kind of interact in certain rooms? But the thing about, blueprints and profiles together is that just because you have a tool that says I can translate requirements into rules in FHIR, that isn't going to give you exactly what you want at the end of the day, right? Because you could go out and you could say, my analogy of like bricks and blueprints, you could tell a bunch of different teams, okay, we're going to build a shopping mall and I am going to give you and your team a set of requirements on like, this is how you build the eastern wing for shopping. And another team to say, you're going to get the requirements specifically for a first floor bathroom. And another team that says, you're going to build the second floor bathroom. And another team is going to get, you build the food court. And if you make them go off and like, take those requirements and design a blueprint for that, and then you say, okay, come back, it's going to be likely that your pieces don't really fit very well together, right? Like if you try to layer them on top of each other, you're going to find out that like the sizing and the layering, like a lot of customs, like materials and like the lengths of the walls and the skills that you might need to build that room, they aren't going to fit. And that's going to be really costly and it's going to take a lot of time and it's going to make you want to pull your hair out. And in some cases, if you're really not careful, it might prevent the use or the proper use of that space for what it was designed for, or it might even be dangerous to use that space under that current condition because of that kind of improper layering. But if I told you, okay, forget that. Every time you build a mall in Canada, the exterior walls have to be built with 2x6 boards, and they have to be this thick, and the length has to be this long. And all the toilets in your bathrooms, they've got to have a P-trap and they've got to be at least 30 inches from the wall. Then you start to have you start to get a little bit of efficiencies. You start to like get somewhere with those types of rules. And so if you think about like FHIR, like a set of bricks and profiles, like a set of blueprints, the way I think about standards is that they're kind of like a building code or a set of building codes. They're not going to tell you this is exactly how you build the room that you want, right? They're not going to give you the most optimal design that to the letter you can deploy against your implementation. But they're going to give you a lot more efficiencies. They're going to streamline the process that you have with your builders, and they're going to make your materials a lot cheaper because the actual cost to produce them lowers when everybody is essentially using materials that have the same sizes for things. And so with a lot of folks, that kind of makes sense. I've done renovations in my home, so I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, of course. But a lot of folks, like the building code analogy doesn't really stick. And so I try to describe why we utilize standards and where the place is for standards alongside the base spec by describing how it hits us kind of close to home as people who build for the healthcare systems, as people who experience the healthcare systems, who to live with healthcare systems. And so when you go out and you say, oh, I really love FHIR, it sounds really cool, how do I go and deploy this in my day job? FHIR can be implemented in a couple different places. So if you work at a hospital and you are wanting to expose your data to the outside world, you might deploy rules in FHIR that say, this is how you map the concepts in your EHR database into essentially FHIR that's going to be exposed to the server. And you might have a set of rules about, these are the types of resources my server is going to put and make available to the outside world that I've done mapping on. And you might have, these are the rules for how a patient portal or an app or an internal program is going to kind of ask for that data in a predictable way, how they're going to interact with the kind of FHIR infrastructure that I've built. And so when we think about, why do our FHIR guides have to kind of align to each other, across boundaries or even across like business units within a given organization? The question that I always ask people is, if you're working in a hospital that's deploying FHIR and you say, oh, I want to make discharge summaries available, and you've got this concept called date of diagnosis. If in your hospital you say, okay, I think I see condition recorded date, that's an element in FHIR that reasonably can fit what I'm trying to go for. But in another place, like maybe across the street, they say, well, I'm looking at condition onset time and that looks really good. Like that looks like what I'm trying to describe. Is anyone, like, brave souls out there, anyone have an idea of what happens if an EMR vendor has to service both of those two hospitals that want the same thing but different ways? Anyone? All right, I'll ask you again in the about applications here in a second. So if, for instance, someone, and I'm just giving you the element example, but there are a bunch of different ways that we can have these variations show up. But if hospital A says, all right, we really care about having that mapped to onset date time, and hospital B says, no, it's recorded date time. What ends up happening is that the structure that an EMR system deploys over its essentially FHIR server that says, here are the rules for how you're going to interact with my information. Here's how, like, my system is always going to behave in a certain way, and here's how you talk to it to trigger that certain behavior, and here's what you can expect in response. When a hospital or an EMR system puts out an API that says, here's how I'm going to predictably interact with you and expose my data to you, and that EMR serves two locations that map to a concept very differently, the way that translates is actually that's a couple different lines of codes in that EMR API, not just the website, but actually in the background that have to change. And that's hours of development. It's database refactoring sometimes, it's QA and essentially promotion of a change in a bunch of different environments. And that takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy. And what you hear a lot of times is who's going to pay for it? And where do you want it on my list of 3 years of things that we want to do to improve our systems? And that's only if an EMR is serving kind of two distinct sites that think these differently. Sometimes the challenges that we run into is also if you have one EMR system that's serving the location and is mapping it one way, and the other one, another EMR system is mapping it a different way, that creates a whole nother type of problem for apps that we're going to talk about here in a second. What I really want to make and drill home for folks is that you guys are all in this program because you're giving your time and energy towards improving the healthcare system. There's something you're passionate about. Usually it's not plumbing and standards, but every time that somebody has to write lines of codes and customize, that's a cost. And it's going to cost our workplaces, and it's going to cost our provinces. And it ultimately is a cost that we as taxpayers and citizens pay. And that's money that could and should be going towards care delivery, care innovation, right? The things that we care about fixing within our system. It shouldn't be going towards P traps and J traps not fitting together the right way. So standards isn't always sexy, but I always say that the thing that you actually get out of it is actually the value that gets most of us out of bed in the morning. And so on the application side, and I guess this is a quiet one, so maybe I won't put you too much on the spot. There's a challenge that kind of a lack of standardization and us all kind of working in our silos and having that translate to differences in our EMRs has. But I would say it's actually maybe even more so felt with applications. So, when I talk about applications, I'm not just my mobile app on my phone. It could also be an application that works within a particular, within your enterprise. It could be an application that's supporting clinical research, public health surveillance, right? All of these kind of folks that need data, data requesters, people that do something with it. They want good data, they want it to be clean, and they want it to be predictable. And they want to know, what is it going to look like? And what's a consistent way I can ask for it? Doug, I see that you raised your hand.
Yeah, what occurs to me, I mean, the application sides of these things are, you know, the development costs and all that are certainly true. But the most fundamental issue here, I think, is that onset date is not the same as reported date, is like clinically is different. These may not be relevant in this particular case, but there are other situations where, you know, that makes a difference to how treatment is done. And I think that that's the biggest deal about not aligning standards.
Yeah, so even as like as a clinician that's acting on the other side of it, which is like I'm trying to say, okay, this is how maybe I would interpret this person's journey through their care, seeing it expressed against one element, and seeing that happen inconsistently might lead you to interpret, oh, these are actually two distinct different things. And I know you guys talked about the Pan-Canadian Health Data Content Framework at the beginning. We're going to talk about a little bit of that, about the base and the core. But that I think is like a really key point to this picture, which is to say, like, beyond just variations that sometimes are unnecessary, there's also sometimes like gray spaces and places where by having like standards that are at the like the data model level and the like, are we all talking about the same thing? That also gives us a better and an even playing field for like then deploying more standardization and FHIR on top of it. So standardization at the point of like collection and care, like, pays off threefold when you try to actually then go and exchange the data, because then everybody knows that they're kind of, when you look at this, it means this, and it's always going to mean that. So really good point, Doug. I think the other, so beyond just like the consumer, so I talk a lot about applications and like Doug mentioned, practitioners, patients, right? Folks that actually kind of want to utilize this data, understand what it means, interpret it in some meaningful way. When you think about it from the application standpoint, you're spending a lot of time doing things like confirming the semantic meaning. You're doing things like trying to do data harmonization when two distinct things actually mean the same thing, so that when you display it to a user, you're giving them a really clear picture, right? Rather than saying, oh, well, it's this and this and this, and we're not quite sure actually if those things are the same or if they're different. But you can actually merge them into one picture to provide an insight, like this is how this person's A1C is trending over time. And so the things that I think that most of us get really excited about are like what you can do with data and what standards do. And the reason I say that they have a place beyond just deploying the base spec is that they give that predictability that folks can kind of build against. They enable folks to focus on like training and refining their algorithms and providing new value and insights, rather than trying to run around and figure out, okay, how do I do the cleanup here? And in this site, it looks like this. It just like spins cycles, right? On the tweaks and not the super meaningful things that they could be doing. And then scaling, right? So bringing it to a bunch of different places, because when you build it once and it works in a bunch of different places, you're not going to be spending that time like trying to onboard hospital A, hospital B, hospital C. So we talked about kind of the impact of just trying to deploy out of the box and like maybe not having that layer of building codes on top of, what we end up kind of deploying and what some of that impact might look like for both sources and requesters. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about like effectively the patterns that we have available to us, right? The ways that we can talk about, are there kind of efficiencies and natural kind of patterns and kind of constraints that we can apply that reduce those variations over time. So we talked a lot about this kind of the lowest level, which was like implementation. So what happens if you just go straight to the base spec and you say, I'm a hospital and I want to do X. So I'm going to dial it back just a little bit. So the base specification, that's your bricks. It's going to be use case agnostic. It's this platform specification. It's going to give you guidance. It's going to give you, in some cases, like a decision model for like, what types of exchange choices do you make? the national base, or sometimes in Canada, we have a national baseline, is like the next layer down, which says, okay, if you were doing FHIR in Canada, but you didn't have you're still use case agnostic, and you're wanting to say, when you operate in Canada, maybe here are some of the ways that we structure our jurisdictional health numbers, or expectations and patterns we see commonly around our medications, right? Like how we convey sometimes dosage in the actual medication code itself. Those types of kind of realm specific concepts with very, very minimal constraints is what we typically see in that kind of next layer down, right? And then we get to like the third level, which a lot of folks like we kind of call our cores. So talk to you about it in just a little bit, but that's kind of the next level of constraints. These tend to be a little bit more prescriptive. So when we talk about like the building code, like, oh, everything has to be this size. Usually cores tend to have like a set number of profiles in the clinical space and a set of rules around, make sure that you have default support for these types of elements. Make sure you can allow for queries against these types of parameters. And it still tends to be somewhat use case agnostic, but like narrowed and typically partnered with some incentives or disincentives that actually make people compliant in that prescription of, we would really like if people did X. That like last level between core and implementation, we call like domain. Sometimes people say like, this is more of like the use case layer. So I think you heard from Alana yesterday about patient summary. Patient summary is one of the specs that we say is often kind of in this national domain space. So it's, if you're doing patient summary, if you're going to be exchanging, a patient's medications, conditions, procedures, allergies, and it's for the, unexpected care, here are the types of, maybe additional expectations that we have for certain elements, but also here's how you package that information together and exchange it in an interaction for a particular purpose. And then we get to that last level, which is maybe you're doing patient summary at Women's College Hospital and you want to say, well, we use this identity provider and we're writing to this particular repository. When you know kind of your defined set of assets and you're actually kind of calling out like, oh, here's some of the connectivity rules around those are the types of details we often see show up in the implementation, in the implementation kind of slice of specifications. And so that sounds like a lot. A lot of times people are like, oh my gosh, that's really overwhelming. And it seems like a lot of people say, oh, it doesn't seem the most efficient. But what I'll say is in the same way that like FHIR is flexible, right? And that can result in, a lot of variations because it allows for a bunch of different ways to solve problems. FHIR is flexible intentionally and standards are layered intentionally. And our decisions and like how we choose to kind of walk a path when we're implementing FHIR ultimately will influence how our systems are designed. And if we're thinking about this, like the path on the screen, the earlier on that we are, right, from trying to say, oh, here's how we're going to tackle patient access internationally. And the more deviations that occur kind of earlier, typically the more impact and the more dramatic that they're going to have, like the more dramatic the impacts are going to be on the actual kind of systems that are being pulled in a bunch of different directions, right? They're going to be like radical changes from how we might do something in, Australia versus Canada, even though we share a lot of the same vendors. And so as you kind of get closer and closer to implementation, what we often see is that your choices expand, right? The potential ways that you could implement when you get more and more specific, those choices open up. And like if we take as a community, let's say we're doing patient summary as a community, and if we all take kind of variations and we have no structure or no constraint around trying to narrow down some of the pathways, that increases our spread, right? It increases our spread and it ultimately like decreases the power of having some paths that are well trod, right? Some that like have been well matured by a lot of people trying them out. And so I always think that it's kind of our inherent responsibility, not necessarily to like reduce choice. And I don't want you guys to take that away from today. It's like, I'm not saying like assimilate. There's only one choice. But I think it's each and every single one of our jobs when we think about standards in our workplace to say, how can I reduce unnecessary deviation? How can I make sure that when I take a path, that I'm really thoughtful in how I do that, and I consider the outside world and what they're doing and their experiences and the lessons learned that they've had on taking a path that's further upstream, so that we're really trying to, so any divergences that do happen, we're kind of trying to move them closer and closer to that final destination, ones that are happening more around like implementation, so that we can really take advantage of essentially paths that are really, really clear leading up to that point. So there's a bunch of standards that, when layered together, that do this, right? We have international standards, we have national standards, we have regional standards. And then, you know, we have folks that are even kind of operating and sharing kind of their practices within a region. And so I think it's kind of this natural pattern for us to say, oh, we've got this bunch of requirements. And so like, we want to design the pathway to that. But when you look at actually the requirements and you try to like map them out against where they're shared, there's these natural groupings of like, it turns out folks that want to be doing patient summary internationally, we have a lot in common, and we can carry a lot of those requirements in that space. And then folks who want to do it in Canada, right? Like there's a spread of the requirements that we can focus on there. So the distribution, when you actually kind of map it out, like naturally falls across a lot of these boundaries. And the intent is, you know, again, it's not to remove your choices, but the way I also think about this is like, how do we use standards to lighten the load? How do we use the choices that we make with Australia, with the UK, with our neighbors in other jurisdictions in Alberta and BC and Ontario? How do we use that to actually say, we're going to consolidate our power and do collective bargaining, right? We're going to make sure that we aren't individually asking for those things and individually paying the costs. We're getting them together, and that kind of both the benefit and the costs are shared. And it also gives us a place, I think, to kind of trailblaze together. So it gives us a safe place to work with our peers to say, we really care about doing X, and let's evaluate what that looks like, instead of trying to do that off in silos and not necessarily having these kind of pooled resources. So I love this view because I think of like standards as kind of like a map. So if you want to go to like Berlin, having international, national, regional, domain standards in this kind of look like, if you're doing it well, slices of a map. So it works really well when like each layer is aligned, right? Like your big highways map up, and each layer performs its function properly. So the regional map is kind of showing kind of major byways to access a given region, and your city map is saying, here's how you get to Port Street. And like when you actively use these together, you have a really efficient way to get from point A to point B. And like there's a consistent way, if somebody wants to take the same path, that you know how to go and do that. And so when we talk about developing standards at our own organization or leveraging them, I want us to think about like, how are we interacting with the maps that are available to us to make sure that you know, we are ensuring that we're aligning kind of our functions and kind of playing to the strengths that each of these layers have. So if you're thinking, this is the most interesting conversation we've had about plumbing, which tends to be like the unsexiest thing in the world when it comes to healthcare, but really standards is plumbing. And so if you're feeling bought in, you want to be able to like leverage whatever is available to you. How do you first know what's out there? And second, how do you know that what's getting built is like mature enough? It like has a level of, it's been vetted, so you feel confident in what's available to you. And how does it kind of come from specification to the space where we might start to call it standards? And I would actually say the answer to this is people. So I started off saying, like, it's just like people coming together and saying, I care about something, I want to volunteer my time towards it, I want to share my experiences and hear about other people's experiences and make something better because of that. That is at the core root of standards, right? So it's oftentimes we call this like the coalition of the willing. It's saying, I care about e-referrals and I have something to share about how it works where I work. And by bringing people together in this kind of coalition of willing, oftentimes in a structure that we call working groups, what we're doing is we're preventing against like Sheridan from going off into a windowless room and saying, oh, I've looked at this problem and this is the objective truth of how do we do with it. because we know that like while everybody has, you know, the ability to kind of do that work and assess something in a silo, we're going to come to a better conclusion when we're actually kind of putting our heads together and also vetting some scenarios and kind of stress testing it. And so beyond just having a group of people that are really excited and that want to kind of contribute into developing an adaptation of the FHIR-based specification to accomplish a given means, the second part of how a Pan-Canadian specification gets developed is process. So I mentioned working groups, right? So it means like this is a collection of people who are committing some time to progressing a set of artifacts. Working groups rely, in order to just not devolve into total chaos, on process. And so what that means is like we have a consistent and a solid way to say, this is how we make decisions. This is how we consistently behave. This is the logic we follow. This is how we document our findings and our rationales and the changes that we make over time. And when you're looking, either participating in that working group or you're looking at the content that's been produced in that way, and you can see, oh, I've got a lot of transparency. This is how they made their decisions. That makes sense. Overall, that increases the maturity and the trust that people have in the content that you're producing through this process, right? And the trust that the world has that may not have been as involved on maybe its stability, right? And the amount of desire that folks have for reuse, because you can put something on the internet, but I think it really doesn't become a standard until it has this ubiquity and until it's like been reused and it has that trust and transparency in the process. So I threw some examples up on the working groups. I think mentioned at the beginning of the call, Smart North, our Smart on FHIR working group. Irfan is one of the co-leads on it. CA Baseline, e-services used to be an example grassroots working group with some hosted working groups, and those are around like specific topic areas. And I want to note, because you know we do have a lot of working groups today, we are absolutely asking you guys to participate, bring your experiences, bring your questions, just bring yourselves. You know, if it sounds great, it is great, and join. But if you don't see a topic area that you're passionate about, like a lot of our working groups are grassroots, right? So they start by someone just saying, oh, is anybody else interested in this? So sometimes I separate this idea of like grassroots versus hosted, because like hosted usually means like if it's been identified in that roadmap you heard about on Monday, I think it was Monday or Tuesday, you guys heard about the roadmap, that it's a special topic area that the set of jurisdictions have said, yep, we want to do this in the next 3 to 1 years. They will typically get additional like administrative support. So they might get people to help with like agendas and like getting your JIRA seats and getting things like, you know, like things the traditional secretariat would do. So like maybe it's Zoom credentials or even leaning on relationships to get certain jurisdictional leads at the table. Those types of things like that are available in our kind of hosted working groups to try to progress more roadmap items, that's all kind of accelerant, right? But ultimately, a lot of the work that we do in the grassroots space is where kind of some of the fires start. So one of the kind of the cases and examples that we give is that the e-services, it used to be kind of Ontario e-referral and then merged to e-services, and now is kind of almost been promoted or adopted into kind of this hosted working group. Started as grassroots, probably the most successful grassroots working group that we have. And so while it sounds great to have all of the access and someone to help you with agendas, like it's not necessary. And it's something that if you care about something enough and you don't see a space for it, there is no barriers and strong encouragement to go and build that space. We need that in Canada. And so regardless of whether or not you're a hosted group or you are a grassroots group, chances are you're going to follow what we call the collaborative standards development lifecycle, which just means how do you kind of progress a set of artifacts through this collaborative space in ways that have kind of consistent, repeatable, like off-ramps. So like to say, okay, we're going to develop a specification, we're going to put out a release for a certain purpose, and we're going to keep refining it. And so this is very much a life cycle. A lot of times when people like look at specifications and standards, they say, oh, like, okay, but when does it end? And there are various levels of maturity. But the most important thing to keep in mind is that like there are kind of, I would say, like segments to this. So there's the development and maintenance cycle, which is very much run by the kind of day-to-day, week-to-week work that happens in the working groups. So that's kind of the develop, decide, then apply, then assess, then release portion. And then at the time of any given release where folks have said, oh, okay, you know, I think we've accomplished the scope that we wanted for release 1 and everything is solid. We've done the QA. We're able to do use case A and B. You put out and you publish that version. And so like, that's when you kind of move over to that left-hand side. And depending on, you know, how many cycles you've gone through or whether or not, maybe you are putting out the release for the purpose of like expanding into more formal feedback, you might, kind of go into another ramp for either going directly into feedback. So you might go into balloting to say, hey, broader set of stakeholders, here's this kind of stable set of artifacts. Take a look at them and tell us what you think. And provide us with that information so that it becomes an input back into our working group making decisions about what should change, what should be enhanced, what should effectively be promoted into a higher level of maturity because people really liked it. And sometimes you might put out releases that say, well, we've gone actually through this feedback process a number of times and we feel like, you know, the content from release 1, a lot of people, like we refined it based on, you know, folks that had provided feedback and it's gone through a number of cycles. Maybe it's time to expose it to like the early adopter community. Let's see what happens when we ask people to like put this in a test system and simulate exchange. Do they find bugs? Do they find places where there were hangups that we didn't plan for? And the outcomes of that feeds right back into that feedback process, right? Which feeds right back into the development maintenance cycle. And so, you know, the more times that the content goes through this process, the more confident folks become both in the working groups as well as outside of the working groups, right? Like the mass volume of adopters, when they've seen this gone through cycles of it's gotten feedback and it's been exposed to a bunch of different scenarios and a bunch of different types of environments. What that translates to is like stress testing, right? They feel more and more confident that it will work in the outside world. And that is what over time increases the maturity level of the specification so that more and more folks buy into it, they adopt it, and it stabilizes through use. So keep that in mind because we're going to talk a little bit about some of the Pan-Canadian standards and specifications that exist out today. We're going to focus in on FHIR, but this whole concept of versioning and release types does come into play. And it's important to know when you're looking at the baseline or the core or the PSCA, like where it's at in its given life cycle, right? How many cycles has it gone through and how much exposure has it had? So Irfan and I were talking about this before we got on the call today, but I think we talk a lot about FHIR. Important to note, when we talk about Pan-Canadian standards and Pan-Canadian specifications, it's more than just FHIR guides. We love to live in that space, and we're going to talk to you guys about that space today, given that the focus is on FHIR. But what it's important to note is that the types of things when we put out a FHIR guide, particularly in some of the Pan-Canadian interoperability specifications that we focus in on, a lot of times around what's the data content look like, right? What does what's the predictable way that you can interact with this? You know, are we saying that this should be pushed to the system? Are we talking about a query for someone's, the service requests that have gone out for that person before? Are we talking about the search parameters and like the things that people might predictably like try to find the information using, you know, a certain type of status, that kind of thing. That's really where a lot of what we write in the Pan-Canadian space and FHIR is focused on, those like first 2 bullets, but they're part of a larger picture. So oftentimes, a lot of specifications that we put out in Canada are a combination of both like the IHE patterning as well as HL7 FHIR kind of exchange rules. And so keep this in mind that the world is much bigger than what we'll talk about today. But like there are considerable materials if you are someone that lives and breathes FHIRs like us for you to kind of start interacting with, start getting exposed to. So the first one that we'll talk about, CA baseline. So if we think about that kind of the set of layers, the CA baseline, as you can see, has gone through kind of a number of its cycles. We use a term called CI build, continuous integration, because we haven't really gone through that formal ballot process yet, but it's been exposed to like hundreds of stakeholders over the course of the last 4 years. And so we've progressively increased its degree of kind of maturity and its assessment of actual kind of version releases. We meet as a grassroots group through the FHIR implementers. So that's a kind of, it's like an umbrella that hosts a bunch of different groups, Smart North being one of them. And we have like both a project page and an implementation guide page for you to interact with the content. The way that I typically describe the baseline is that it's that kind of realm specific materials, and like it tends to kind of have to operate in the space of being use case agnostic. We know that these are going to be the rules that show up a bunch of different places, regardless of whether you're doing e-referral or patient access or patient summary. Like, we take in the baseline a lowest common denominator approach, which means what are the things that we would expect to show up, both because they're uniquely Canadian, right? So like that jurisdictional health number, like what's the pattern and what does that look like? But also, what do we expect to see consistently show up across FHIR implementations in Canada, just by nature of us trying to look at each other's guides and saying, here's what we've noticed is true, like with the current state, right? About what is available and expected in summary format from what jurisdictions and what individual kind of FHIR authors have put out today. And that it sounds strange, right? It sounds kind of like a little step, but we found it to be a tremendously kind of impactful, both exercise as a community to go through and to say, oh, we've noticed that your spec has this, doesn't have this rule that we saw within the baseline. Can we talk about that? And can we understand whether or not maybe it's something that should be relaxed in the baseline? But that by having those conversations and also exposing what we find and through what we call socialization, we're doing this kind of soft harmonization, right? So that where in the past, sometimes we looked at each other's content, we'd say, oh, I see Ken's doing this and I see Armand's doing this. By putting it in the baseline, we're kind of saying, start here, like look at the rules that we found to be consistent and ubiquitous so far in the folks who are writing content in FHIR. And, you know, after you look at those rules and feel confident about, it's likely your needs are going to at least include these, but definitely exceed them. Now go to the use case or domain specification that's closest to what you want to do. Be confident that the rules that we've identified in the baseline upstream are going to be in that kind of domain-based guide. And that, like, effectively, if you saw a rule and kind of built against it in the baseline, you can expect that it's going to be showing up in your kind of downstream, the further down the layers that implementations require. And so, you know, the challenge with trying to do this approach is that we tend to kind of have to be very careful in not being like prescriptive beyond what current state can accomplish, right? So our focus was mostly like surveillance and soft socialization. But when we were going through this process, right, as a bunch of volunteers, I think there were a ton of us that said like, oh, we would really like if we could keep this, if we didn't have to relax this because we found out that actually a bunch of other people maybe don't have that capacity today, that people were really passionate about wanting to change our system so that in the future, maybe we would have the capacity to collect and exchange that. And enough people kind of expressed that opinion that they wanted something that would go beyond just the floor of like what we all have in common, that we knew eventually we would get to this point where we could start having conversations about like the core, a prescriptive core, right? Like this is what we would ask for if we could just get systems somehow through incentives or disincentives to support this element. And so, you know, we work towards the baseline for, I want to say it's like our 5th year going, knowing that eventually like everything that we'd collected over time would start to kind of feed into what might be a prescriptive baseline once the kind of governance and incentive structures started to get in place. And like that's where things actually, I think, have the biggest jumps and kind of the most interesting impact when it comes to actually like changing the capabilities that by default our systems have, or at least the capabilities that they have to expose that information to the outside world. So that brings us to the core. And I think maybe you guys heard a little bit about it yesterday with the Pan-Canadian Health Data Content Framework. So I won't belabor that part. What I will say is it's incredibly new. We've wanted it for a very, very, very long time. We spent a considerable amount of time talking to other countries about how their bases and cores and domain guides work together, learning what works, what doesn't work, how they interacted with their national data model. And so, you know, we had an idea of like, oh, we want to hit this target of like some level of prescriptive, you know, moving the bar. But the process and the way we went about it and the way that the decisions are structured in the core, I think is still a very emerging space. And so when you think about that collaborative standards development lifecycle, I would say that the true content of the core, like the rules for condition, are very, very, very early, to the point of like they are just exposing and getting reactions to it. But what we're really trying to do at this stage is actually to expose our process for developing the core, right? Like use the communities and use the ability to kind of put something out for feedback as a way to say, tell us what you think about the way we're approaching this. Tell us if you think the way that we're translating from the framework into a set of FHIR expectations makes sense. Tell us what can change. And we're encouraging people to kind of give us their feedback on, you know, are we hitting the mark? Are we going about this the right way? Even if we don't necessarily have a ton of information on like, what's the element that's going to be must support at this point in time. And so I think you probably heard about like all of the kind of feeds that go into the Pan-Canadian Health Data Content Framework. The most important thing to know is that like the core and both the true core and any of the surrounding kind of domain profiles, right? The PSCA, the e-referral, the acute care, those types of kind of rules will all flow up from the framework. And that's how we can try to protect against some of the challenges that Doug had mentioned earlier, right? Of like seeing things show up in data and not knowing if they actually are semantically the same or semantically different. But it's very early in its own development, right? So they just finished an open review of the framework very recently. We've been working with the team side by side and saying, okay, can we start by just like exposing, this is a concept right now, and here's how we think that probably maps in FHIR. And this is a terminology that we think is probably going to be recommended, but still has to go through review and feedback. Can we just expose it to the folks who maybe aren't architects or data modelers, and they're more on the kind of implementation application side of things? And the intent is to allow for folks to kind of get exposed to this process and understand the relationship, even while we're kind of waiting for more prescriptive expectations on like, everybody has to do this, everybody has to have this element demonstrable to come through like a structure similar to like what we might have and what we've seen in some other countries around like US and Australia around like a core data for interoperability, a set of things where it's like everybody needs this. So it's very early in development. It stacks with the baseline, but basically it's FHIR, base specification, Canadian baseline, Canadian core, domain guides. And so the intent is that it's supposed to be able to be used across a bunch of different domains, a bunch of different use cases. And so the types of things that you can expect in core are going to be, you know, what are the elements that we think that most folks should be able to expose and have default capabilities to expose at the point of exchange, right? So when data travels. And then the last piece I'm going to just talk about, and I know I'm running tight on time. If you're interested in these kind of like these middle levels, CAPEX is a really interesting guide as well. So think of the core as these are the rules that we want every kind of server in Canada to follow around the elements that are available and like the types of resources that might be supported. CAPEX is around like, what is our expectations that we want to make sure every FHIR server in Canada has on the ways that things get exchanged. So if you have a rule about like, we want to make sure that everybody has allergy intolerance, I think verification status is one, maybe it might be condition, but that everybody is able to support that. That kind of thing might live in the core. a rule that says, okay, if your systems support allergy intolerance, because we know like some systems may not. If you're an immunization registry, you may or may not care about allergy intolerance. You might. But if you do support allergy intolerance, then what CAFEX says is you have to be able to allow for queries that combine both information about the patient and information on the clinical status of the allergy, so that you could say, find me Sheridan's active allergies. That's really powerful, right? It's really powerful if everybody that says I do allergies can do that, and can do a number of other combined kind of searches. And so just like we talk about raising the floor for like data content and elements that are available, CAFEX is the guide that you go to understand like how do you raise the floor on like how things get searched for, right? The types of operations that people might support, conditional expectations that come into play when they support a particular resource for a particular purpose. So highly recommended. It's one of those that like has gone through trial implementation of a subset of its content and just went out for 2.0 draft for ballot for further feedback. So, but I'm going to skip over PSEA because I think you guys heard about it quite a bit yesterday, and I'm hoping that you go out, read this back, come to the working group community, and pass it off to Irfan to talk a little bit about one of the more exciting domain-based guides that's available as well.
Thank you, Sheridan. So for the Pan-Canadian e-referral e-consult guide, unlike PSCA, which was derived from an international standard, IPS, as folks might be aware of, the Pan-Canadian e-referral consult was actually based off of a jurisdictional guide, the Ontario e-referral guide, which was then built up to the national standard, and the works that's kind of gone in there. Now, the Ontario guide was already established. There were vendors that were already using this guide, and there was a lot of kind of support already and expertise in here. So like the work that was being done there was more of an uphill challenge where we needed to now relax a whole bunch of constraints on it, introduce harmonization on the work that was kind of being done between the early adopters on the West Coast versus folks in Ontario who had the vendors who had already done a lot of the work in there, and a lot of vendors actually, not just one or two major players. So that's kind of a challenge that we faced here. But this guide has now come together. We've put a lot of work in there. We went through the process on what it needed to, the work we needed to kind of do in selection of the use cases and all that stuff, which I'll go into and what that process looks like. But that's kind of how the Pan-Canadian e-referral consult guide comes in, starting more on jurisdictionally and regionally, moving to the national part. And now we're gonna go. Sheridan, if you have
I was just gonna ask. Okay, so I know obviously it's expanded a lot. The specific use cases that are like the biggest focus on from this last release, will you remind me of those real quick?
Yes. So the first use case is the actual booking of an e-referral. Sorry, the selection and sending of an e-referral from one specialist to another. To just get a little bit more kind of information there. The second major use case is the piece around central intake and how an individual, a specialist, might send this to a middle person who's then able to kind of take this this patient's information, connect them to the right individual across the jurisdiction or across Canada if they like, and the process there. And then third one is actually the conversion of an e-referral to an e-consult then, and the process there and what that kind of looks like. So those are some of the use cases that e-referral and e-consult guide covers. And what are the patterns in there, and what does that look like? What does that process look like?
So if that sounds like something you guys are doing like in your own spaces, or like you've maybe done in the past, like it's a really big space that I think like can use as much experience as possible to contribute in. And I think it's like the group is talking about scoping out use cases in the future as well, right? For like how we might enrich this.
Yeah, and because this is just the first version, and there's a lot of other functionalities that are gonna come out of it. For example, the introduction of the integration, sorry, of service directories into e-referrals, which is something that we're going to talk about next, and what that looks like. Spoilers there. So the Pan-Canadian Service Directory kind of is in development right now to help support e-referral, but not just e-referral at the moment, but maybe some other guys that might use a healthcare service directory to search for providers or services, so on and so forth, organizations that could connect for a number of different uses. And so you kind of have to keep that in mind while you're kind of creating these guides. Definitely something to keep in mind. The e-referral, of course, has an impact on how the Pan-Canadian Service Directory is being developed, and folks, feel free to join into this. Oh, Doug, you have a question? See your hand up.
Yeah, a couple things. One is I see this says private project. What makes this a private project?
So the reason why this is a private project is we have just gotten started in terms of the talks for what's the use case going to look like. What are the what is in scope for this service directory and what it's going to cover. There isn't really a guide or
profiles, or it's like literally we created the space last week.
Okay.
Yep.
My second comment really is that a couple decades ago, the Western Canadian provinces did something called the Western Health Initiative Collaborative, and they did something called Provider Registry. And so Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and BC did the Provider Registry. And sounds like a very similar kind of thing. Are you building on that kind of initiative?
Yeah, and those are definitely kind of things to keep in mind. Those are more local-based directories, registries, sorry, that can then feed into that national level, and something that we need to keep in mind. Ontario also has their provincial provider registry. Oh my God, these names are really hard to say sometimes, but they have like their own kind of guidance available on that and on how to use it. But now taking all of these guidances and collecting all of them together and putting them together at a national level where we have those base specifications for everyone to kind of utilize, and then from there they can they're able to kind of devise and plug in their own registries and provide that information upstream is something that is really important, and the work kind of needs to go in there, and why these working groups are there, because they kind of provide a little bit more context for their own jurisdictions as well.
Yeah.
Stuff like
so that. And to that point, and I know we could probably talk about like the e-scans and stuff forever, but there is like a step that we typically will take whenever we're kind of starting to feed like data into a work group, like an environmental scan, where we look at like international, what's maybe happening in another nation, and then also like what's happening locally and jurisdictionally. And I know, Irfan, you just had done like an e-scan that like looked at not just like the very, very much service focused use cases, but also like what the interplay was between like provider and services and relationships between providers and organizations. So like as part of the standards process, whenever we start, we usually do an environmental scan and we try to say, okay, what are the use cases that we're seeing show up in a bunch of different places? And then how do those use cases translate to like resource selections and profiles and choices within profiles? So maybe, Linda, I'm thinking like, I feel like the environmental scan would be like a good follow-up topic for another date, but it is a really interesting process that is probably repeatable in a lot of spaces to do the kind of comparisons.
Sounds great, Sheridan.
Yeah. Are you, sorry, was there anything else that you wanted to make sure we touched on, Irfan?
No, not at at this point, but I would highly recommend folks who just want to see what this process looks like from the start. We have just gotten started. There's a kickoff that's happening on May 16th. And if you go on InfoBay's kind of link, and the link that's kind of available in the guide, sorry, it may be a little off. I can correct that link and send you the right one later on. But you can definitely go on there, see, join in. It's a welcome all kind of group, and you can perhaps just you don't need to speak. A lot of the folks on the call usually don't speak, but just hear what the process looks like, see what the findings are, and what the process in the background looks like in development of a guide like this, as well as what goes into the evidence that kind of goes into and expertise that kind of goes into this. So yeah, something to definitely look out for.
Perfect.
Awesome. So Sheridan's already kind of gotten started on what that standards development lifecycle process looks like, and I'm just using the example of the Pan-Canadian Irfan e-consult guide. Yes, definitely we started off with an environmental scan, find the relevant guides. In this case, start internationally, look nationally as well, and also locally if there are any guides kind of available. In this case, we had a perfect guide that was available at the local level, but also internationally, there was the IHE 360X guide, which was available with very similar use cases. And there was a cross examination that was kind of done. And that's where the structure of your guide and the use case analysis, as well as the scoping piece kind of goes. See what's consistent. What are some of the repeating patterns? Are they kind of complementing each other, or are they just completely against each other? Usually, if you're finding similar kind of patterns, it's good to repeat that. And again, build on other people's established, used processes as well as profiles and stuff like that. Because hey, it's good to use kind of what's out there. The next piece is, of course, the set of the environment, as well as then going into those pieces and starting to now create those resources in your guide. What you see here is a GitHub environment set up for the referral e-consult guide, and then a link here for FHIR on seeing what those profiles look like, what those value sets look like, and everything that's kind of related that goes into building that guide, as well as the guide itself and its various iterations that you may see potentially. And then next up, once you have all of this kind of established, there's a process where we talk a lot in the working group, and we get those experts in. And once we have something stabilized, as Sheridan said, we then put it out to the experts, the implementers, and see what their thoughts are. Have we missed something drastically, or is what we're seeing kind of making sense to them? And then that's kind of where the balloting process sits, where folks are able to, from various organizations, jurisdictions, and organizations, just able to submit their comments and concerns or anything like that. Those come in our case, in JIRA tickets, one of which is what you see on the screen here. This wonderful ticket came in talking about just a value set and some of the related kind of changes that we needed to make. Very minute stuff, but these can have drastic impacts on codes that maybe the vendors have already used. For example, I've talked about how Ontario had vendors already kind of using those codes. And if we had something that was even slightly different, it can be system breaking, or it can have an impact on functionalities and stuff like that. So keeping that standard kind of going and keeping that in mind, not breaking the status quo sometimes, is something to keep in mind. In this case, when the ticket comes in, it gets triaged. We see whether we need to make that change immediately, or if there's a little bit more discussion that we need some clarity on it, stuff like that. Once we have that information, we assign it to a party who's responsible for making those changes, and then somebody acts on it, and what does that act look like? Well, that's the next piece. So in this case, we went ahead and made the necessary changes. In this case, giving it the right names. You can see
I
on
can
line
actually zoom in.
18.
I have it here. 1 second. Can you guys still
Perfect. Thank-
see? Can you guys see my screen with the history?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just in the message event code now, and I just went to history, and I think these were the two versions you wanted to compare, right?
Precisely,
Okay.
and that's one of the excellent kind of functionalities here as well. In Simplifier, you can go in and see, like, compare your latest work to your original work, what that looked like. And it's really great to kind of track that across the whole timeline as well. You know, as profiles do tend to miss these from time to time. It's a really great way to kind of get your memory back. But in this case, on line 18, Sheridan, if you have any inputs, go right ahead.
There. The only thing I was going to say is also like, not only as an author, but if you're coming to this community for the first time and you're like, oh, like, okay, I think they made a change at some point in time, but I don't know exactly what that change was and like what the context behind it. History is an amazing tool. To say, oh, okay, I can see that in this release, this was the thing that like, and this was the discrete line of code that changed or the terminology that was added.
Yeah. And I'm going to be honest,
big enough, I can zoom in.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Perfect. In this case, on line 18, you can see that on the left, we have add service request, and on the right, we have add service request. Perfectly normal. But the one thing that we had missed while coding this was that the add service request on the left was an older version of this this guide that we had used, this value set, sorry, that we had used. And on the right, it was just an addition of that simple dash, which could have changed things drastically. So adding those things, the changes in terminate versus revoke as the language, which the working group had talked about and accepted that, hey, this brings a little bit more clarity to things. And moving forward, that's what the system's kind of going to follow. Those are the things that you kind of bring together and put together and package then and bring it to the working group, and they're aware of like, hey, these changes have been made and we're good to go. And that's kind of the process that we follow in this development. Later on, there could be additions to this value set. There might be folks who want to expand the list, and that can be brought up later in the working group, and you will see those changes come in. But the process essentially will be similar to what you saw. But yeah, that's kind of my input on that. Any questions? Any inputs? Sheridan, pointing to you.
No, I mean, I mean, the only other thing I was going to say is like, I feel like this is a really good example of like something that was put in between releases. So like a lot happens in the working groups to say like, oh, you get a request. The group uses like a ticket to discuss what do we want to do? How do we call back to those processes to make decisions and make a decision that is informed by what's the impact going to be? What's the value? And then ultimately like that results in change, I think is the big takeaway here.
Yeah, precisely. Wonderful.
I can let me just, is that history thing new to anybody? Have you guys ever used that before? Or will you be using it after?
I'm gonna be honest, I've used it before. When I think it was for CA baseline. I'd seen some of the work there. It's really good to kind of follow through on that.
I see Naomi in the chat says she's gonna be using it now. Awesome. Okay, so you guys learned one thing today. History, it's amazing.
Yeah, we got a few converts. That's fantastic.
So hopefully, let me just make sure. Okay, we were there. So hopefully there's a few more things that we can teach you, or at least point you in the right direction to teach you with specific kind of profiling behaviors, which I think is a good segue for GIST.
Yes, absolutely. So GIST, or jurisdictional implementation style guide, is a wonderful tool for authors to kind of how would I best say this? It's the best way to kind of collaborate together, either if you're developing national standards, jurisdictional standards, or even like local implementation guides. Anything on those fronts, it provides you a way to kind of use use kind of all the tools and tips and any like additional information that you kind of need to follow a standard that's standard pattern in this defined standards development lifecycle that folks are using across Canada. And it's just a really great tool for folks to use that then to develop any of their guides and just be part of this whole collaboration. Within GIST, we've actually highlighted a number of things. So we've given folks patterns that we use, whether that be like direct adoption or using your own, developing your own extensions, or talking about how must-supports are supposed to be used in a guide. Anything like that is available for you to kind of peruse through and see how you would use it, whether you're doing that for yourself as an author, or if you're just a curious developer who wants to kind of see what goes behind the scenes in developing in writing these guides and why you should be following it and stuff like that. So there's all of these things that we have available and is highlighted in GIST. There's also additional information that is available for more of those higher level experts and who want to go about the process of creating their own guides, but need a little bit more information. All of that's available in GIST. Now, what is the purpose of creating your own guide, right? The way I'm going to describe this this wonderful graph that you see in front of it is I'm going to go from the most abstract level to the most specific use. So that actually goes down from international to the jurisdictional level. So it's going bottom up. Now, the international guide kind of the international guide gives you patterns and guidance around how systems that have their scopes and use cases kind of defined should behave. They're pretty high level, pretty abstract, and they cover a larger scope essentially. That something like an IPS would be giving you information across just to the systems that need to kind of do this globally. What are some of the use cases that will be covered and stuff like that? The more national guides will give you architectures, workflows, more definition on the actors and who's going to be doing what. The scope is now kind of the level of information is starting to now slim down, and you're getting a little bit more information out of that. At the jurisdictional level, you're writing about everything, additional information on constraints, why they're there. I don't know, like you're building off of the national level and getting into a lot more information. Why is that requirement there? Is that requirement based on maybe a specific regional need? For example, let's say like a lot of the systems, or I'll give you an example, unfortunately, of Ontario, because I am from Ontario, of our there's no one single custodian in Ontario of all of the provinces information. So now there's a number of requirements that are kind of limit, like that's a hurdle there that needs to come over, and there needs to be additional guidance around it for vendors to know about. And so that requires an additional level of specific information that kind of needs to go into it. And that's kind of where we're getting a lot of the information there. And so those are the different purposes of the guides. Sheridan, jump in if I've missed any
Well, the only other
information.
thing I was going to say is I thought I pulled it up. Actually, I can pull it up within the style guide. Is there anything that like any page that you would say, okay, this is where you might recommend like drilling into next if like folks want to kind of understand like maybe what some of the pattern guidance is or stuff like that.
Yes, the technical patterns consideration, really great place to kind of start on there as well. Just what we see authors use going from when it's appropriate to adapt from international, national, or do your work at the regional level. There's a neat little section that helps you determine which patterns are right for you. It's right in the names. It's really helpful over there. And also there's a lot more guidance around what is direct use, what is use of direct use. Missing the word on it.
And then I think there's like reprofiling.
Yes, reprofiling and stuff like that. And how you I think we have an example of how we go from IPS to something more local. Oh, there's actually a national to jurisdictional level example there, which is fantastic. Yeah.
So plug for Lloyd's going to talk to you a little bit, I think about maybe questionnaires. Lloyd's also one of the authors on the, I think it's called FHIR or HL7 best practices. There's a lot of content in here that's about best practices, a lot of content that we pulled from that guide, but like also tried to kind of drill in and talk about like, what does that mean as somebody who is trying to make a decision about like, do I reprofile, right? Are there places where I can change the terminology? And also like, how do I assess the impacts of that within the level that I'm in, if I'm a jurisdictional author or if I'm an implementation author. So there's like a lot of really good content around how do you specifically apply the best practice and make that the decision based on where you are, as well as I think like Irfan had said about how do you actually go and select the parent that you want to build on top of, or how do you say and point some things to say, oh, I impose all these rules, but I also like, I'm not going to repeat all of them. Those are the rules that I do have in my profile as well. So, I don't know. I know a number of folks, I think that we've chatted on with this call have started to kind of dabble, but highly would recommend it. There's probably more than we could ever talk about, within the guide, but yeah. Anything else? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. The only thing I want to say is GIST is not the only place where you can find a lot of this information. We're actually going to give you all the resources, or at least a list of resources that we think are a really great place to start. Now, if you want to pick some of those national guides that are available, or jurisdictional guides, regional guides that you want to perhaps start exploring, Canadian Fire Registry on Simplifier is a fantastic place for that. It has all the guides which have their own unique profiles, their extensions, all that just in there, and that kind of covers the information that you need. But then if you want to go a little higher, maybe you're not just focused on the Canadian Fire Registry and you want to see what's around the globe and what's out there. FHIR.org guide status has a fantastic collection of almost all the extensions, all of the different profiles and where they show up in different guides, nationally or internationally, and how they're kind of used, and a little bit of descriptions on it, as well as the links to then go double click into exactly what you need off of that. That's also available. And if you want to feel like you're kind of lost and stumped on where you can find additional information, chat.fire.org is a fantastic place. Go where we have experts like Sheridan myself, who are kind of available there. Lloyd's going to be on there. There's hundreds of implementers there that are ready to just answer your questions. I love just kind of being a fly on the wall and seeing what discussions are going on. So I can go and then bug Sheridan about some of those questions as well. It's really great.
I go and bug Lloyd about them, so like, it's all a big cycle. But it's amazing resource.
Absolutely, and it's just a great time to like, it's free to join. Go and just look at what's out there, and start digging into what you're curious about FHIR. So there's that.
The only other thing is, like, I always say, what is it? What's the phrase? It's duplication is like the best complement, right? So like in the standard space, it's all about like looking at what other people are doing, trying to copy it if it works for you, and like having that actually be a good thing. So going to like our own Canadian FHIR registry, looking at the extension registry and what extensions people are posting, chances are someone has thought of the thing that you want to do, and it's a great start to look at how they've addressed that problem and try to align. So I love, Debbie, your comment about opening a can of worms. Like, we love questions, we ask them too. So you're in the right space.
Yep.
And I know like we're a little bit tight on time. Questions like what types of questions you have for us? What types of things do you feel like are holding back from like joining these communities and participating in these spaces? We're open books.